Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 begins, "There were giants in the earth in those days." It's a verse famous for its notoriety, an element of almost alien mythology turning up in the foremost pages of the Bible, this wording here from the King James Version. An inspiration that there were fantastical giants on, or maybe in, the earth according to these scant few references across the early pages of Scripture. Interpretations differ in the extreme, but as a total image of the world grew, these giants fell away. Myth falls away to undiscovered country, or, as the Bible says, the stranger comes from a far country. What countries are further than the icebound north and snowbound south? The icy lands at the North and South Pole are the final terrestrial frontiers. Frontiers make good settings for mythology, legends, and fiction. No surprise the North and South Poles are white canvases to be drawn upon. The extreme poles have no natural civilizations, they have essentially no native history, and thus they seem to have no past. The Arctic and Antarctic can act like literal iceboxes of mythology, symbols, and ideas. Tradition, for short. Maybe there, in the Earth, there are giants? Perhaps. The image of the polar regions is then a menagerie of mystery and truth, a pseudo-history of ideas, once respected, that were dummied out from popular consciousness. The literal fringes of the Earth keep fringe ideas alive in their icy vaults. The Arctic regions seem like the veil between the bonds of the Earth and the promise of space and the pole star beyond. Despite its inhospitability, mystics, east and west, have long described the color of the Arctic as a verdant green. It is a fertile field in imagination. The poles have their own associations, the attraction of the north and the repulsion of the south. Thule ultima, Thule, the furthest land. That is what the Greeks called the ends of the earth. In the 1st century, Seneca the Younger wrote his play Medea, a tale of the legendary sailor Jason's spurned wife Medea, a princess of the far-off country of Colchis. On stage, Seneca's chorus proclaims this to the audience: "There will come an age in the far-off years when ocean shall unloose the bonds of things, when the whole broad earth shall be revealed, when Tethys shall disclose new worlds, and Thule not be the limit of the lands." It is called Seneca's prophecy. It may be the earliest use of the term New World, or worlds here. Seneca speaks about a land beyond the northern Thule, or Thule, a land regarded as everything from a paradise to a place of empty night throughout history. This is the mystery of the furthest lands, and the world beyond even that. The word Arctic and its antipode, Antarctic, come from the Greek arctikos, derived from arctos for bear in Greek. The association with bears comes from both the northern regions and the North Star, Polaris' location, to the north. The prominence of Ursa Major in the sky lent its positive association of strength to the north. In opposition, the ancient Greeks hypothesized an equal, frozen region to the far south, Antarctica. The Greek root is Antarctikos, or anti-Arctic. Antarctica held both negative linguistic and magnetic associations, in contrast to the northern Arctic. Arctos was a vague concept in antiquity. The term boreal was preferred to gesture to northern regions. Greek mythology spoke of a Hyperborea, or a land beyond the northern wind. Quite literally, the term Hyperboreos meant pertaining to the regions of the far north, hyper meaning far here. While often described as a paradise beyond the north wind, the actual content of Hyperborea was disputed between stories and regions. Some took it to be a paradise where the tribes of Hyperboreans worshipped Apollo in spherical temples. Others assumed it was the icy regions of Scandinavia. Either way, since Hyperborea was unreachable, those empty limits were filled by fiction. The first to challenge, or provide fodder for, the fiction of the North was Pytheas of Massalia. He left an important book from around 330 to 320 BC, On the Ocean. Now lost, but later references attest it was a treatise on the ocean and an account of his expedition. As a Greek explorer of lowly, obscure origin, he was hailed and derided as both liar and hero. Why was he the first Greek sailor to prod northern Europe? Well, Pytheas was the first to write it down, and he was also the first to circumvent the Carthaginian monopoly in the western Mediterranean, sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Strait of Gibraltar, and break the bonds of the Atlantic. Pytheas delivered to Greece the first report of Arctic ice and ice flows near a mysterious land he called Thule, or maybe pronounced Thule, or Thuli, or Tile. There are many possible pronunciations. The Greek astronomer Geminus of Rhodes preserved one excerpt from Pytheas's On the Ocean, where he claimed, "It seems that Pytheas of Massalia came also to these far northern regions, at least he says in his treatise On the Ocean. The barbarians showed us the place where the sun sets, for it happened that in these parts the night becomes extremely short, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 hours long, so that the sun rises a short while after sunset." Where and what was this Thule, or Thule? It was clearly northward, an unclear frontier region, but obviously an island of some kind. Pytheas claimed his Thule was 6 days' sail north of Britain and near the frozen sea, a description that gives the exact location of Thule some flexibility. Conservative estimates place Pytheas' landing among the northern Orkney or Shetland Islands, north of Britain or Scotland. Liberal estimates believe he sailed as far as Iceland. The most extreme, and likely impossible, claims believe Pytheas reached the Arctic ice itself. The placing of this Thule would become a controversy throughout antiquity, and even into the late Roman Empire. Later Greek historian Polybius and geographer Strabo did not believe these claims from On the Ocean. They regarded it as outright fiction on the level of the Hyperborean tales. Pliny the Elder's Natural History from the mid-1st century takes a more neutral tone than them. On the topic of Britannia, it reports, "The most remote of all that we find mentioned is Thule, in which, as we have previously stated, there is no night at the summer solstice, when the sun is passing through the sign of Cancer, while, on the other hand, at the winter solstice there is no day." Here the location becomes muddled again as the Natural History locates Thule in some reachable distance of the Arctic Sea. At 1 day's sail from Thule is the frozen ocean, which by some is called the Cronian Sea. The Roman historian Tacitus would report a Roman fleet sighted Thule, but by the end of the 1st century, Tacitus's Thule was likely not the same as Pytheas's Thule, or the idea of what Thule exactly was. By then, the island was abstracting into complete fiction. In the Pythian, or Pythian Odes, 500 years earlier, Pindar, prior to Pytheas, had skewered this controversial north with the line, "But neither by taking ship, neither by any travel on foot, to the Hyperborean folk shalt thou find the wondrous way." The philosophers reckoned with these Hyperborean folk. Both Plato and Aristotle's Earths accounted for the Arctic and its southern mirror. Both theorized the far north and far south should be the coldest regions on the planet, though both also claimed the equator would be uninhabitable due to intense heat. Either way, Plato and Aristotle's worldview made it a ready habit to attack the fiction writers and paradoxographers who regularly inflated claims of northern wonders. The paradoxographers were a kind of writer in the ancient world who recorded or invented wondrous claims, their regular settings being distant lands, hard to prove or disprove due to their distance. One point of contention was the reality of Hyperborea. Herodotus, well known for indiscriminately recording any claim in his histories, repeated the Hyperboreans lived northward of the Scythians in the Asian steppe and kept griffins which guarded gold, supposedly. Aristotle countered this by saying these griffins were simply vultures who hoarded gold. In the more extraordinary, Hecataeus of Miletus, according to Diodorus of Sicily, reported the Hyperboreans were a Titan race descended from the Titans of Olympus, perhaps giving them the proportions of giants due to their bloodline, but descriptions of the Hyperboreans vary. If the skeptical Hecataeus believed any of these extraordinary claims is unclear. These stories were repeated by later writers, though intermixed with elements of actual truth. Such strange distortions can be attributed to the ancient Greeks' distaste for pure fiction, as it were. Ancient fiction had to be prefaced with some element of pseudo-history in either setting or character. Paradoxographers laundered wonderful tales as history to avoid the bias against pure fiction, or to just make a buck on the gullible public, an intermingling which would long color the perception of the polar regions. Antiphanes of Verga was the most notorious of the ancient paradoxographers, regarded as a questionable tale-teller even during his life. Antiphanes' name became synonymous with unbelievable stories. In the 4th century BC, he published the Apista, or Unbelievable Things, a major document of the paradoxographer's genre of fantastical tales. Though lost, Antiphanes' Apista presented his stories as undeniably true, which lent them an air of credibility. Because of that, his Apista was referenced as legitimate and parodied for centuries after his death. The main derivative of Antiphanes' Apista was Antonius Diogenes' The Wonders Beyond Thule, from the 2nd century AD, a pseudo-historical romance about fabulous adventures beyond Ultima Thule into the realms of sun and moon. Unfortunately, The Wonders Beyond Thule is lost too, a common issue which repeats here. Much of the writing and writings that reference each other are lost. The Wonders Beyond Thule remains only a synopsis by the Christian Photios of Constantinople. Antonius, through a complicated story within a story in his novel, claimed his work came from ancient sources recovered from stone tablets. It was likely sarcastic. Sarcastic or not, the Roman writer Lucian of Samosata, Antonius's contemporary, would parody The Wonders Beyond Thule with his own adventures beyond Thule, the True Histories, otherwise known as A True Story. It is obviously not. Lucian was well known for his sarcasm. The issue with Lucian's story is the material it is mocking, Unbelievable Things, and Antonius's The Wonders Beyond Thule are lost, so scholars are somewhat lost in interpreting it. Either way, the True Histories was intended as an extended parody of the paradoxographers. Like Pytheas' account, it commences with a journey beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic. It next involves phenomenal events as varied as ascending to the heavens through a whirlwind, wars between the peoples of the sun and the moon, and journeys to the islands of paradise, which involve meeting both Homer and Odysseus. It concludes with the promise of a sequel which was never published, another swipe by the ancient post-ironic Lucian at the gullibility of the public. How fictional, factual, or historical Antiphanes, Antonius, and Lucian intended their works to be is its own issue. It seems to have mattered little to later writers. Many took them unknowingly, or very well knowingly, as fantastical fact. They would cohere as a very early core of polar fiction in imagination. By the 4th century, the Latin poet Claudius Claudianus, known today as Claudian, was referring to Thule. We, whithersoever thou goest, thee we will accompany even as far as Thule, lying icebound beneath the pole star, or to the burning sands of Libya. Thule, or Thule, here is still inconsistent and vague. Claudius seems to take Thule to be a poetic name for Scotland, as he goes on to say it was warm with the blood of Picts, and next refers to an icebound Hibernia, Ireland. The reference was confusing for later scholars of this polar mythology. So, by the end of the 5th century and collapse of the Roman Empire, Thule Ultima was not much better defined. Hyperborea became Thule, which was still vaguely gestured to as simply the North. The inward focus of the Middle Ages would end polar interest in earnest for about the next 1,000 years. Only Norse exploration and colonization of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland would skirt the hem of polar regions. Scholars, though, in the period, would settle on the identification of Thule as on the edge of the known world, probably Iceland or beyond that. The English chronicler, Geoffrey of Monmouth, attested of Thule under the name Atlas, which he wrote of, receives its name furthest from the sun because of the solstice which the summer sun makes there. A cohesive effort to define the Arctic only resumed in the late 1570s with the work Britannici Imperia Limits, or Limits of the British Empire, a mystical and fantastical manuscript fitting for the British alchemist, sometimes con artist, Dr. John Dee, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. Why? Dee argued for the British Empire's rightful claim to the Arctic regions. How? Dee produced his own claim that King Arthur, yes, the King Arthur of Camelot, himself had conquered the Arctic, giving England a rightful rule of the North. While Dee's claims seem baseless, and they essentially were in fact, John Dee was well-learned and connected enough to produce an actual argument for his position. It bordered on forgery, perhaps, but was competent enough for what he desired. Dee's three major sources were the work of the previously mentioned Geoffrey of Monmouth and summaries of two mysterious 14th century works, Inventio Fortunata and Gestae Arturi, Arthur's Achievements, sometimes also known as Arturus Gesten. Inventio Fortunata was a description of the North Pole, and the Gestae Arturi was an account of King Arthur's colonization of the North Pole. Dee claimed that England's enemies, left purposely vague by him, had destroyed these works because of their importance to the country. Dee believed England had rightful rule to the entire Atlantic Arctic Circle, at the least, which included Iceland, perhaps known as Thule, Groenland, a phantom island which Dee assumed to be Greenland, Wineland or Winelandia, an anglicization of the Norse Vinland, Estodiland, or northern Canada in some respect, Atlantis, which Dee equivocated with the Americas, the Septentrional Islands, an old name for the North Atlantic Isles, which included Svalbard and perhaps as far east as Novaya Zemlya in Russia. These regions have imprecise names and are essentially phantom islands because Dee derived them from the cartography of the time. All these claims were produced anyways, so England could lay claim to the Northwest Passage, a supposed trade route rumored to circumvent North America via Arctic waters for Asia. Where did Dee acquire these summaries, though? From a source no less reputable than Gerardus Mercator himself, of the Mercator map projection. The Dutch cartographer exchanged now damaged letters with Dee around 1577. It was Mercator who introduced Dee to the questionable descriptions of the Inventio Fortunata, which Mercator claimed to have read, but only in summary. Yes, in summary. Mercator's information was itself a summary of a summary. Dee had developed his theories from what was literally third-hand information. Mercator did not have any copies of either Inventio Fortunata or Gestae Arturi. Those had been lost by the 1500s. What Mercator had read was a summary, which he had also lost after he loaned the book out to a friend. His excuse was literally, "I lost my copy." He accredited it to a mysterious personage named Jacobus or Jacobus Noyen, an older rendition of Knox, of Herzogenbusch, who, as Mercator related, traveled the world like Jean Mandeville, but described what he saw with better judgment. He wrote in the Belgian language. The ideas about the northern regions which some time ago I extracted from him follow word for word, save for where the sake of brevity or speed I have translated into Latin, when if not always his words, I have retained his meaning. Jacobus was a legendary traveler, like the fictional John Mandeville, who traveled Europe, Asia, and Africa, but not the Arctic. That Jacobus wrote about from the Inventio Fortunata, which, according to Dee, was actually by a wandering English monk from the 1300s. Jacobus had just cribbed his description from the monk's writings. The Inventio Fortunata is the greatest and most persistent work of paradoxography. It is from which Mercator and Dee's descriptions of the far north derive. Due to the proclaimed source material, the Renaissance Arctic was filled with cliches of far-off lands common in medieval European historiography. Dee's Arctic is a divided land, a ring divided into 4 unequal portions, divided by indrawing seas or channels between them. The lands, crusted with impenetrable mountains, surrounded a massive whirlpool, often called a maelstrom, and a mountain at its exact center. The indrawing seas and whirlpool were believed to circulate the Earth's waters. Dee, perhaps influenced by Arthurian legends of a magnetic castle in the north, notes that the mountain at the center is made of lodestone. Mercator describes it in Latin as the rupes nigra, or black rock. Then a common, but now forgotten, trait of adventure stories. These black rocks, or magnetic mountains, were believed to pull the nails from boats. Renaissance cartography, inspired by Ptolemy, placed one at the North Pole to account for why compasses were drawn north. Mercator and Dee were not the first to publish such ideas. In 1507, the Flemish cartographer Johannes Ruysch published his map of the world. Ruysch's map followed the design of a mountainous expanse, 4 separated lands, indrawing seas, and a northern magnetic mountain. So similar, if not the exact same, as D's. Ruysch, though, named these 4 lands Eronfe, Hyperborea Europe, and Insula Deserta. The 2, Insula Deserta, essentially mean insular desert or wasteland, which were uninhabited. Ruysch's Hyperborea Europe was the Greek Hyperborea and connected to Scandinavia. Eronfe is the most mysterious of Ruysch's creations. Unlike the rest of the map, it has no clear origin in history or mythology. Ruysch, and later adopters of his ideas, so perhaps D and Mercator, believed it was inhabited by a race called Eromfe, or Eromfi, perhaps equivalent to the legendary one-eyed Eramaspi, said to be the enemies of the Hyperborean griffins. So maybe these were giants too? It's kind of hard to tell what his intentions were. The Mercator D maps then, perhaps inspired by Ruysch's ideas, included their own inhabited regions of the Arctic. Both giants and pygmies featured in D's 1580 map. The mystic believed, beside English colonists left over from King Arthur, there were ancient cities scattered across the North Pole, homes of fantastic peoples among the mountains. In his own version of Orumfe, D, inspired by Inventio Fortunata, declared the northern reaches of Grokland, or Grönland, Greenland, were inhabited by men 23 feet tall. Though never directly called giants by D, the parallel is obvious. D also declared that pygmies, or tiny peoples, inhabited this north. D's pygmies, though, may be more factual than his 23 feet tall people. A possibility is Mercator misinterpreted the Skraelings of Vinland, as described in Norse accounts, as small people. These populations, which Mercator explained to D, John D then mistook to live in the far north. D's North Pole was a very lively place. All of this was questionable in the end, even for the time. Most doubted the manuscript of Inventio Fortunata ever existed. But Inventio Fortunata seems to have been real in some form. Other European scholars of the era, independent of D and Mercator, such as Ptolemy de las Casas, referenced the work as trustworthy to some degree. The existence of Jacobus Neuen of Herzogenbusch is questionable, though. Whatever the first form of the material later known as Inventio Fortunata, it was likely originally brought to Norway in the 13th century by a refugee from Greenland. Its contents became distorted until they ended up in the hands of Ruysch, Mercator, and D. This image of the Arctic persisted well into the 18th century. By 1701, the London periodical, the Athenian Mercury, was answering, "Why does the needle in the sea compass always turn to the north?" with, "The most received opinion is that there is under our North Pole a huge black rock, from under which the ocean issueth in 4 currents answerable to the 4 corners of the earth or 4 winds, which rock is thought to be all of lodestone, so that by a kind of affinity it draweth all such like stones or other metals touched by them towards it." In the 1700s, the French would be the first to examine the Arctic in both a critical and fictional lens. The European adventurer Giacomo Casanova would write much about the Arctic in a fictional aside of his memoirs, Eco Samaron, 1787. A tongue-in-cheek tale about the inner Earth beyond the Arctic and its strange inhabitants, in which Casanova adopted ideas from the Renaissance interpretation of the Arctic. Beside being one of the earliest tales of Hollow Earth fiction, Casanova's Eco Samaron involved an entrance to the inner Earth through the Northern Maelstrom. It was an early fantasy of a jungled inner Earth, akin to Jules Verne's later 1864 novel, Journey to the Center of the Earth. There was much scientific interest directed towards the Arctic by French intellectuals. The early naturalist, Georges-Louis Leclerc de Comte de Buffon, would propose a theory on the natural creation of the Earth outside religious scripture. The Comte de Buffon's scientific theories accounted for the creation of the Arctic. Buffon believed as the hot Earth cooled, post-creation, the Arctic would have been the first region inhabited by life. While Buffon's theory simply theorized life would have first emerged in the inhabitable Arctic regions, Buffon's contemporary, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, elaborated on it as fact. Bailly was a prominent French revolutionary, leader of the tennis court oath, and later mayor of Paris. Though Jean-Sylvain Bailly's Arctic theories seem far from scientific today, Bailly's ideas combined Buffon's cooling Earth hypothesis with his own concept of ancient astronomy. Bey proposed these speculations in works such as A History of Ancient Astronomy, 1775, Discourse on the Origin of the Sciences and Peoples of Asia, 1777, and a treatise on Indian and Oriental Astronomy, 1787. While not as extreme as later ancient advanced civilization theorists, Jean-Sylvain Bey's theory of ancient astronomy is the early model for them, essentially. Bey believed all major civilizations of the world, Egypt, Chaldea, meaning Mesopotamia here, China, and India, were descended from a single mysterious, perhaps advanced according to some, source civilization. How did he reach this conclusion? Bey believed astronomy, his specialty, the most ancient science, was first developed by a lost civilization. All science, culture, and religions were derivatives from that civilization. After its destruction, according to Bey's conclusions, its descendants, the ancient Scythians, steppe tribes, migrated south and established cultures in Eurasia. Where did Bey locate this lost original civilization? In Siberia, on the Arctic Rim, directly, according to him, on the 49th degree around Scandinavia. Bey believed mentions of the Hyperborean paradise were memories of this lost civilization. Hyperborea he also confabulated with a true Atlantic Atlantis, believing they were one and the same. Ancient memory simply intermixed them. Now highly questionable, Jean-Sylvain Bey's ideas were competent enough for the time, though marred by speculation with little backing fact. While Bey's ideas withered on the vine, his conceptual influence did not. The Parisian intellectual kept up a correspondence with his countryman, the philosopher Voltaire. Voltaire was not convinced of Bey's belief in a northern Garden of Eden. He was, though, convinced by Bey's concepts in abstract as challenges to established scholasticism, mainly the Catholic Church's insistence of humanity's origins in the Middle East as wherever the Garden of Eden was located. A tenet Martin Luther had already challenged during the Protestant Reformation with the declaration, "The deluge, great flood, had permanently hidden the garden by changing the face of the world." Bey and Voltaire both believed that reason, instead of religious traditions, could locate the true origins of humanity. Unfortunately, Bey was guillotined during the Reign of Terror before he could convince Voltaire of anything much. Voltaire had, after all, already declared, prior to Bey, in 1761, that it was India which was home of the most ancient and purest religion and the cradle of all civilizations. The existence of India and China complicated the question of human origins in Europe. It was Voltaire's Indo and Sinophilia which led him to locate the origins of civilization on the banks of the Ganges, not the Euphrates or Nile River. Voltaire, like Bey, believed in astronomy as an original science. In Voltaire's schema, astronomy and culture spread outwards from India. It was a theorem which Voltaire's influence in the Enlightenment would spread. His brief time in Prussia, in the court of King Frederick the Great, would proliferate this idea to his Prussian contemporaries, and through them, later German philosophy. In the quest for the Garden of Eden, metaphorical or not, early German philosophy found the perfect union of religion, science, and philosophy. The prestige Voltaire's name brought to the question of human origins ignited a search. Many later giants of philosophy would venture their own guesses. Immanuel Kant would broach the question of human origins in his philosophy lectures. While he never produced a concise, published theory, Kant seemed swayed that humanity originated in Tibet. The mountains of Tibet were, as Kant put it, mankind's ark. His logic was that as the biblical flood receded, the first civilizations would have emerged in the Tibetan highlands. As Voltaire with India, Kant believed all primordial culture spread out of Tibet. He went further than Voltaire and contemplated that the original Tibetans had populated the rest of Asia and then the world. Looking for biblical foundations, the philosopher believed the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, of the Old Testament, was equivalent to the Hindu Brahma simply because they rhymed. Then, while not the Garden of Eden exactly, Kant's Tibet was the original civilization in his ideas. Moving slightly to the west, Kant's student Johann Gottfried Herder proposed his own theory of human origins besides his notes on Kant's ideas. Herder agreed humanity originated in the Asian highlands, but he believed the Garden of Eden was in Kashmir. Herder's Kashmir theory was based on the concept humans would have first emerged in the mountains. He supported this idea by claiming that as Central East Asia shown the greatest human racial diversity of the Old World, that, to Herder, suggested all of humanity diverged from the populations of the area. Herder's beliefs then would create a very early basis for later biological research into human origins. Hegel, yes, that Hegel, proposed his own religious interpretation of human origins. Hegel's theory boiled down to the idea that human religion emerged in the Far East, developed as it spread westward, then was fulfilled in the religion of the Prussian state. Remember, he was a Prussian philosopher. Hegel saw Chinese Taoism as the basic magic religion of humanity from which all religion grew in varying forms. The development of religious complexity in Hegel's philosophy was a chain one could follow back to human origins, basically across Eurasia. What do these German divergences have to do with the Arctic or Antarctica? Kant, Herder, and Hegel's ideas, by way of French influence, would clear the ground for the science of comparative mythology, a scientific craze that would sweep Europe and the Americas around the mid-1800s. Nowadays, comparative mythology is more literary than scientific, but it was an early field of anthropology. The belief cross-referencing mythology and symbols could help create a scientific view of history, mainly through reconstructing primitive myths. In its conceptual phase, it was believed to be a critical field to finding the origins of humanity. While an interesting process, it was a faulty, questionable tool based mostly on speculation. It resulted in some strange conclusions. European discovery of Antarctica in the 1700s, then the rush for the Arctic in the later 1800s, would not help. The most famous advocate with the most bombastic theory was Reverend William Fairfield Warren in 1885 with his book Paradise Found, The Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole, a 500-page argument advocating nothing less than the origins of humanity at the North Pole. His theory was far less absurd for its time than it appears now, though. William F. Warren was not a nobody either, but the first president of Boston College. He developed his ideas well before the hypothesis of continental drift, and believed there was a frozen, tropical continent below the Arctic ice, so he was working on some different logic than scholars are today. Warren proposed this submerged Eden was equivalent to the ancient Greek Hyperborea. All mythological references to earthly paradises were foggy cultural memories of this land, and all mythological symbols of spears and poles, unknowing references to the magnetic poles of the earth. He even proposed mythological giants were, if the first men were of the stature and strength and longevity as supposed, how certainly would traditions of the fact linger in the memory of mankind long after its exile from its earlier and happier home. An attempt, perhaps, to explain away earlier references to giants in the north, and give an origin to the Garden of Eden. Geographically, Warren's Paradise Found made sense for the 1800s then. He believed humanity had descended down the sides of the globe and across Earth. Warren's book did have some, what would be called today, scientifically founded information. One was his belief in land, or ice, bridges, as he quoted. Another authority in this field, writing of the theory that continuous land once connected Europe and North America at the north. Another was Warren's belief in the importance of migrations in human prehistory and radical shifts in global climate regions, though somewhat extreme in his vision. Even writing a poem on his somewhat fantastical environmental interpretations, when the sea rolled its fathomless billows across the broad plains of Nebraska, when around the North Pole grew bananas and willows, and mastodons fought with the great armadillos for pineapples grown in Alaska. Paradise Found would quickly fall out of the public consciousness, despite its limited appeal, but decades later would reemerge as a major document of the intellectual fringe. So Warren's book briefly refocused Arctic interest in the United States, but in Europe, the Arctic was coming under mystical Eastern influence. This was due to the Indoology in German philosophy after extended contact with Asia in the 1800s. The European Oriental societies which sprung up were importing and translating large amounts of Hindu and Buddhist scripture. Cross-pollination between these ideas would produce a very strange intellectual mixture. The first modern philosopher to broach a mystical interpretation of the Arctic was the French proto-socialist Charles Fourier. Fourier's utopian beliefs called for total harmony across the world, which would bring about total equality. Once accomplished, Fourier believed this harmony would turn the Arctic and Antarctic into a boreal and austral crown of the Earth, perhaps meaning the aurora borealis would reign over the world for thousands of years. This popular European utopianism of the early 1800s would mix with the growth of spiritualism and faux Eastern mysticism as the 1800s went on. It was mainly the influence of Tibetan Buddhism. Translations of the Kalachakra Tantra and other mystical Buddhist scriptures would popularize Dharmic cosmology and European thought. But as Asia became more reality and less a fantasy, this Buddhist magic, as it was symbolically and literally called, was focused in other directions, often as an alternate or challenge to established churches. The practice of comparative mythology would dig its teeth into the classicalism and Buddhist mysticism in vogue at the time. The importance of the North and South Pole in European esotericism emerges here. Relying on the Kalachakra Tantra, scholars began to examine the ancient Hellenic view of the world against the Buddhist image. One topic of importance was Mount Meru, or the axial mountain of the Hindu and Buddhist universe. Mount Meru, according to strains of Dharmic literature, is the mountain at the center of the Sifa Dipa, or White Island. Dipa also translated as continent sometimes. Mount Meru and the Sifa Dipa, according to some, sat at the center of the 4, or 7, lotus petal-shaped continents of the world. It was at the head of Lake Onotata, Oandit, which was the source of the world's water, a black mountain above a maelstrom at the center of a white island. It may or may not have actually been black, though. European mystics and scholars associated Mount Meru with the Rupes Nigra, or magnetic mountain of medieval Renaissance lore. Here was a strong bone of comparative mythology. Later mystics declared that these myths, and their varying translations, were drawn from the same source. The traditions of Jan Sivan Bey's so-called ancient civilization were soon revived in questionable spiritualist circles. The overflow of religious information in Europe would run off into this chic spiritualism of the mid and late 1800s. The amalgamation of the Theosophical Society was the result in 1875. Beliefs promoted by the Russian mystic Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a synthesis of scientific and religious assumptions of the 19th century coupled with outright mysticism. Chris Riley describes the patchwork spiritualism of Theosophy, wisdom of God, as a spiritual vocation of Byzantine complexity. Theosophy may be understood as a unique bricolage of spiritualism, ancient mythology, Eastern religion, and the legendarily turgid mystical novels of Edward Bulwer Lytton. Most at the time demeaned Blavatsky's insights as simple parlor room Buddhism, but her pseudo-spiritual Theosophy was the next link in the chain of odd polar beliefs. Blavatsky adopted strains of comparative mythology between East and West to account for her cataclysmic history of the world. According to Blavatsky's visions, legendary continents like Hyperborea, Atlantis, and Lemuria were all real, each inhabited by a different age of humanity, though maybe not humanity as biologically understood today. She believed each age of humanity was destroyed by a cataclysm like the biblical flood. The first two were the Polarian on Mount Meru and Hyperborean, which, according to Blavatsky, was the Arctic, which, in ages past, surrounded the original ocean on the top of the world. This Arctic ring continent, once again Dee's medieval lore reemerges here, was Blavatsky's equivalent to Bai's original civilization, which she claimed was the same as the Hindu period of Manvantara, or a imperishable sacred land. This distorted Hyperborea was the sunken Eden of Theosophy. As Jocelyn Goodwin described, Blavatsky's Hyperborea is ambiguous in this regard. It is geographical, being situated at the North Pole, yet it is immaterial, meaning that one will probably not find it if one looks for it with their mortal eyes. Blavatsky's synthesis was impactful for better or worse. Theosophy would cohere into the first major branch of European esotericism in the 19th century. It was not without later opponents who sought to preserve other pre-modern forms. The second branch of European esotericism would come from the controversial pen of the French mystic René Guénon. Guénon was a constant critic of the Theosophists, even penning the attack Le Théosophisme, Historia d'un pseudo-religion, Theosophy, History of a Pseudo-Religion. His attacks on fads of spiritualism and faux Buddhism were common, advocating his perennial philosophy above debased mysticism as he saw it. Gwenol's beliefs in tradition of East and West veered more towards the symbolic, but not without their indulgences, such as a belief in the subterranean paradise of Shambhala. Similarities between Gwenol's metaphysical tradition and Blavatsky's theosophy are due to drawing from the same source materials. Gwenol's writings on tradition, as he called it, are a complex, closed system, but one of his own making based on the bones of things like mythology, mystical literature, and some forms of Hinduism. Gwenol looked towards the Arctic through the ever-popular lens of the late 1800s. To him, Meru, the axial mountain, should be equated with the symbolic polar axis. Meru was the common center of the world, or the 7 Dvipas, which surrounded the White Land. He regarded common conflations of Atlantis and Hyperborea as pointing towards the primordial traditions of the North Atlantic, though Gwenol never exactly specified if he believed them to be literally real or simply symbolically real. A symbolic, spiritual well which all cultures drew from, a Western equivalent to Hinduism in India. One of Gwenol's famous popularizations was the equivocation of Greek mythological eras, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, with the Hindu yugas, or ages, universal periods of rise and decline, though here modified to Gwenol's own symbology. He overlaid the Eastern cyclical universe of reincarnation on the Western linear timeline of creation and apocalypse. No consensus would be reached on these ideas, but Blavatsky and Gwenol were consequential in their own rights. One of Blavatsky's disciples was the Russian Orientalist Helena Rerik, and her husband, the artist, always in exile, Nicholas Rerik, friends of the Theosophical Society at its peak, though not exactly followers of the doctrine. Nicholas Rerik was well known in the early 1900s for his own Tibetan Buddhist-derived mysticism and paintings of Central Asia, which you have been seeing. Taking a distant note from Immanuel Kant, the couple went searching for the origins of humanity in Tibet and attempted to find the mythical Buddhist city of Shambhala, a secret, pure city which existed either in Tibet or inside the earth itself. They found nothing, but Nicholas Rerik's artwork and Helena's writing did much to mystify Buddhism in the West. The Rerik family's wake was tangible in Europe, America, and Asia. In India, emerging Indian nationalism was receptive to the sympathetic Orientalism of Europeans. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, one of the fathers of modern India, would do much to nativize the myths the West had projected onto India. In 1903, he published The Arctic Home in the Vedas. It is exactly what it sounds like. A theory of northern Arctic genesis from an Indian perspective. Tilak quoted heavily from William F. Warren's Paradise Found, and he was much convinced by Warren's hypothesis. To add to this, Tilak contributed his own symbolic mythological analysis of the Vedas, Hindu holy scripture, to the conclusion. Tilak combed Hindu scripture for references to a primordial Arctic paradise, mainly in references to northern paradises and long nights. He even identified the Arctic as the original home of the anthropological Indo-Aryans, statements which would soon be politicized. As noted, Bal Gangadhar Tilak was not a fringe intellectual, but one of the first leaders of the Indian independence movement. His influence would be very consequential across both spiritualism and politics. Theosophy and perennial philosophy were a potent mixture in the political radicalism of pre-1940s Europe. In Italy, a theosophist by the name of Arturo Regini, an early neo-pagan of an authoritarian bend, would introduce, later self-described super-fascist, Julius Evola to Gwenol's works. Evola would adopt some of Gwenol's concepts, but diverge in his own belief after falling out with Regini. A menagerie of fringe concepts would fuel Evola's mystical, militaristic ideological beliefs. A hyper-right-wing mysticism opposed to theosophy's spiritual left-wing, if one can even apply such terms here. Where Evola diverged was in his open, incendiary political involvement, his grounding belief in an ancient Arctic continent where lived the first humans in a society based around a warrior caste. It was much the same in Germany, where in 1918 the notorious Thule Society was founded. Esotericism, racialism, and fascism would mix to world-changing results. The Nazi in Antarctica myth has been covered elsewhere, though, the major promotion of a Chilean diplomat post-World War II, Miguel Serrano. A man so taboo and perplexing, nothing sufficient can be said about him. Needless to say, Serrano's beliefs, no matter how confounding, were an offshoot of this polar mythology in a strange form. In the United States, the polar traditions found a better home in early pseudoscience and fiction rather than mysticism like in Europe. The border between both was blurry there. the old world obsession provided plentiful raw material for American writers. On April 10, 1818, John Cleves Symmes Jr. published his #1 circular. It proudly declared about the Earth, "To all the world, I declare the Earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth, and am ready to explore the hollow. If the world will support and aid me in the undertaking, I ask 100 brave companions, well equipped, to start from Siberia in the fall season with reindeer and sleighs on the ice of the frozen sea. I engage we find a warm and rich land stocked with thrifty vegetables and animals, if not men, on reaching 1 degree northward of latitude 82. We will return in the succeeding spring." Endearingly absurd, and basically pseudo-scientific even at the time, but Symmes' circular is one of the earliest documents advocating a scientific Hollow Earth theory. It was predated by the German priest Athanasius Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus, Subterranean Earth, in 1664, and the English scientist Edmund Halley in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1693. Kircher's work proposed a subterranean land which circulated the Earth's waters and winds. He also thought dinosaur bones were the bones of giants. There, again, are giants. Halley, an influential thinker, was the first to propose the concentric Earth model, or the idea the interior of the Earth is like a nesting doll with multiple Earths. It's unclear if Symmes read either volume. Either way, he never got his expedition, though the United States Congress entertained the idea for a brief moment. Though never accepted as mainstream, Symmes' proposal was a fringe fantasy for authors to chew on. Edgar Allan Poe would come to learn of Symmes' Hollow Earth theory by way of Symmes' companion, the editor Jeremiah N. Reynolds. Poe tackled the mysterious polar regions in his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, 1838. A tale of the cursed descent to the South Pole aboard whaling ships through impossible cannibalistic tribes, strange weather phenomena, and to the oceanic wasteland of Antarctica itself. Before the postscript alludes to southern Antarctic civilization, Arthur Gordon Pym encounters a gigantic, shrouded figure in the Antarctic fog. It is never made clear what the figure is due to the cliffhanger ending, but it can only be assumed Poe was alluding to the myths of giants in polar regions, or the figure was some sort of unknowably vast ancient ruin. In his 1897 French fan sequel to the narrative, The Sphinx of the Icy Regions, Jules Verne describes the figure as a sort of sphinx of ice. This sphinx, at the center of the South Pole, is highly magnetic and pulls metal towards it. It is that which traps and kills Arthur Gordon Pym, a modern form of the Rupus nigra, or magnetic mountain, in fiction. The trope of unknowably ancient polar civilizations would enter the mainstream decades later by way of the Antarctic fringe in H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, which would modernize polar mythology away from the fantasy of giants to the science fantasy of aliens. Though the story was predated in concept by Lovecraft's own 1921 short story, The Nameless City, though that takes place in a desert. At the Mountains of Madness is about an expedition to impossibly vast Antarctic city of the decayed Elder Things and their Shoggoth servitors. It would become the later model of ancient alien science fiction stories. Well read, it is doubtless Lovecraft was familiar with Bailly's original civilization, the symbolic darkness of Antarctica, and his own admitted influence from Poe. Lovecraft's influence on the Antarctic mythology was immediately obvious. In the 1940s, the self-proclaimed true account, the Heflin manuscript, supposedly began to circulate. Containing early ancient alien theories, the manuscript was about the 7 cities of Antarctica. 7 fantastical cities created by alien life forms, sometimes called Martians, who were the celestial ancestors of humanity. Antarctica, which they colonized when it was a tropical paradise, is referred to in writing as Motherland of the World. It's a shadowy interplay of everything from ancient fantasies of Hyperborea, William F. Warren's Polar Paradise, this time imposed on Antarctica, to Blavatsky's faux Eastern mysticism. It's all present in the Heflin manuscript, alongside UFOs. One of these cities was referred to as the Rainbow City for its rainbow design because it was constructed of massive colored plastic blocks. This rainbow city was the original cultural center of Earth, but is surrounded by impenetrably high ice walls. There's your flat Earth connection. It can now only be accessed by subterranean tunnels, which connect the 7 cities. Subterranean tunnels and ancient Antarctic cities, of course, being major plot points of Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Rainbow City itself is a largely original concept, but one could point to earlier mythological associations of rainbows and paradise. Its plastic construction seems an idea purely out of the 1940s United States, though. The identity of the Heflin manuscript author is unclear. The Heflins, who supposedly first privately published the manuscript, are obscure. They appear to have existed, but if they actually had anything to do with this Rainbow City myth is unclear and seems unlikely. By now, all this modern paradoxography should sound rather familiar. It repeats itself. So step away for a moment. In 1946-1947, American naval officer Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd Jr. attempted to put a conclusive end to the mystery of Antarctica in the United States Naval Antarctic Developments Program 1946-1947, better known today as Operation High Jump. High Jump was Byrd and supporting officers' effort to map Antarctica. The main objective, beside establishing a scientific base in Antarctica, was to prove the polar continent was one singular landmass. A question which Byrd's earlier expeditions to Marie Byrd Land, named in honor of his wife, had been unable to conclusively answer. Though, in February 1947, the operation would be cancelled and recalled due to intense Antarctic weather. The event would be popularized in the American consciousness by the 1948 documentary The Secret Land, which chronicled the research operation, High Jump, and the secret land of Antarctica. The Secret Land, the documentary, would establish for Byrd a reputation as the greatest latter-day American explorer, though unfortunately now rather forgotten in popular consciousness. Rear Admiral Byrd's statements on radio and in papers would prove ready fodder for mysticism and conspiracy. In his radio announcement from Antarctica on February 1947, at the conclusion of Operation High Jump, Byrd declared, "I'd like to see that land beyond the pole. That area beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown." Then, upon his return to the United States, added, "The present expedition has opened up a vast new land." Believers in polar fringe theories taking this to suggest Byrd had discovered more in Antarctica than was obvious, either some greater landmass or discovery of an unknown enemy there. Neither is true. The idea misconstrues Byrd's other parallel warnings from The Secret Land and contemporary interviews about polar warfare and a hypothetical future conflict, a topic that highly concerned Byrd. This land beyond the pole and vast new lands to which Byrd referred is the regions Operation High Jump was unable to explore due to early cancellation. Byrd would later return to Antarctica in 1955-1956 anyways, with the international expedition Operation Deep Freeze 1. The land beyond the pole myth would remain popular, though. The largest proponent of this land beyond the pole was one F. Amadeo Giannini, seemingly no relation to the American banking magnate of the same name. An incredibly bizarre but influential figure in early American conspiracy circles who believed in what was essentially an infinite Earth, his own pet theory. Prior to Byrd setting out with Operation High Jump, Giannini warned Byrd that, upon moving beyond the South Pole, his plane would be sucked into another world. Rear Admiral Byrd ignored Giannini, but Amadeo Giannini did not ignore Byrd. Later, in 1959, Giannini would publish his thesis, World Beyond the Poles, Physical Continuity of the Universe, to explain his infinite Earth theorem. It did a poor job, but it perpetuated several ingrained myths around Operation High Jump and the Arctic. Giannini, though he contradicts himself in the book, described his belief that space, yes, the space in the sky, was part of the Earth. All the planets were other landmasses on the universal ocean. In his view, Earth was like two infinite planes that met at the poles. Maybe. Or maybe it was a sort of tube? One could travel to other planets by sea or air. Someone then could cross this boundary by moving across the poles. Giannini's theories were confounding, exceeding even the logic of Flat Earth, and it's unclear if they even made sense to him. His Earth maybe looked something like the interior of a hollow candle with a celestial and terrestrial surface, the atmosphere, or space, between them. It's hard to parse. Beyond the book's perplexing descriptions, it went on to popularize several myths about the reality of the North and South Pole. or simply became fodder for other experts. All of Giannini's claims are questionable. He was only entertained by the public because paranormal magazines, such as Flying Saucers, found him amusing. One of Giannini's assertions was Byrd had made a secret expedition to the North, not South, Pole in 1947. There he reached beyond the known limits of the Earth. It never happened. It was another bit of the man's fiction, like Infinite Earth. It seems Giannini conflated Byrd's controversial 1926 North Pole flight and 1946-1947's Operation High Jump. Others, later in the 1960s, would assert Giannini was correct by pointing to a supposed secret diary of Byrd from 1947. But this was a forgery. Byrd had published his own explorer's diary, but only one. This second diary, which records a mystical experience in the North Pole, was written by a Walter Siegmeister. There are references to Siegmeister as a member of the German Thule Society, but this is bunk. Siegmeister, a Russian Jew, and later naturalized as Raymond W. Bernard, was a New Age mystic. The scene in the second secret diary, where Byrd meets a secret master straight out of Theosophy at the hidden land beyond the pole, is an almost one-for-one ripoff of a scene from the 1937 film Lost Horizon, a movie where a British agent, on an accidental expedition, meets a High Lama in the lost Tibetan city of Shangri-La. With all the interest in reinvigorated global exploration at the time, it is clear Siegmeister's main inspirations for the forgery were adventure movies, faux Eastern mysticism, and his own commitment to his New Age beliefs. Siegmeister, or Bernard's, expansion on the older theories of Giannini were as faulty as the source material. It would have been impossible for Byrd to reach the North Pole in February 1947 anyways, due to the near total darkness of the Arctic winter. Byrd never made any secret flights to the North Pole, none that can be obviously proven at least. When asked to support any of his own claims by the press, Giannini would always respond, "You can find all the information in the New York Times." That then shut the door on polar mythology for now. It's not in the New York Times. All modern claims and conspiracies of the Arctic and Antarctica are largely recycled ideas from this more than 2,000-year history of rejected knowledge. What of claims of pyramids or lost cities in Antarctica? Nothing new. They are modern restatements of John Dee's claims on Arctic cities inhabited by giants or pygmies, as Jean-Sylvain Bailly's theories of an original civilization in the far north. Though today, such myths have been displaced to the South Pole. There are two reasons for such urban legends popping up in Antarctica. One, because it is the last mysterious region on the globe, and two, Antarctica now seems a more likely Hyperborea or Atlantis. It is a graveyard of both continents and legends. What of Nephilim or giant aliens as people claim to witness across the polar ice? Point again to Ruysch, Mercator, and Dee's maps. The modern giants have been reskinned with elements of biblical eschatology and conspiracy, or simple science fiction. The final far country on Earth is Antarctica, a place which history and mythology can be freely projected. Popular conspiracy, and really culture in general, believe there has to be something in all that ice, even if they are just random images of giants on Google Maps. Governmental conspiracies relating to the United States, other major powers, and a New World Order are common as well. Those have a far different heritage, though, and are only believed by an ardent fringe. Travelers can freely enter and exit Antarctica. Only citizens of signatory countries on the Antarctic treaties need permission from their governments, or the ports themselves. Technically, there are only 42 signatory countries on paper. What is going on in Antarctica, and to a lesser extent the modern Arctic, then? It is a buildup of a unique tradition or lineage of rejected knowledge throughout recorded history. There is an anti-human image about vast ice sheets. When the human mind lacks sensory input, it begins to create its own for stimulation. The North and South Pole are mental canvases. Pareidolia, the mind conjuring images and randomness, is common to both Arctic and Antarctic formations. Those pyramids, they are probably nunatics, or glacial islands. The ones that resemble pyramids are actually called pyramidal peaks, or glacial horns. These nunatics are the result of land jutting above ice sheets, which is then worn down by erosion. Famous mountains like the Matterhorn were formed by the same process. It results in the semi-pyramid formations that some see as ancient ruins. Recognizable shapes, but they are not impossible for nature to form on its own. Unfortunately, no verified South Pole ruins yet. Though, maybe Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft will end up being right one day. In other ways, though, these lost traditions have been vindicated to a degree by modern knowledge of Antarctica. In the last 100 years, it has become clear there is a landmass below the Antarctic ice. A graveyard of landforms that drifted southward, the dropped parts of continental drift. This patchwork continent beneath the snow and ice was probably once tropical in the remote past, but it was definitely not a paradise. This was long before humans as well, but it was able to support its own native life. So it is still unlikely Yonge-Sivant Bay's original civilization would have existed in Antarctica, but it does somewhat vindicate William F. Warren's belief in a tropical pole, though on the bottom of the Earth instead of the top. While it in no way proves any polar mythology, it does show some advocates were not totally wrong-headed in their beliefs. There was then once a place beyond the wind. It was the south wind, though, not the north. This then is why the Arctic and Antarctic are both totally new and utterly ancient. Unsettled but not unnoticed by human history. They are omphalos, or the world navel, both origin and end. An original emptiness, as it were, the last frontiers where the leftover fringe beliefs of long ago can still endure. Ice keeps anything warmed over or rotten in ready condition. Do not mind the common cabin fever. The magnetic reality of the poles will surely outlast whatever odd stories we give them.
Checkmate. Checkmate.
Bitch.
Just to chill a little bit, because this is a longer video, so it took a little more time and effort, I do have a Patreon you can support if you want to see longer videos like this one, and I do have a Twitter anyone can follow for updates. I usually don't make that known, but those are there in case you want to use them, okay? Thanks everyone. I would like to give a thank you I cannot pronounce to my supporters, Fraser and the Gelsomini family.